I've had the singular and the sacred privilege, because of being a pastor and a chaplain and a counselor, of pulling up a chair and of being a part of what one therapist calls the alarm moments of people's lives. It is varied in circumstances and in intensity. I think of the living room many years ago in another place, late night, husband storming around the house, screaming and shouting, wife wilting into the corner, 1,000 shards of broken mirror sprinkling the carpet and winking up at me in the darkness and the light. I sat there and thought, I'm seeing life fall apart for this family. I remember pulling up a chair next to a hospital bed. If I had not known this was her, I wouldn't have recognized her. She had been young and vibrant and vital, full of life. But the last 2 years, she had done hand-to-hand, mano-a-mano combat with this terminal illness, this mortal enemy. And now she was ravaged, face gaunt, eyes rather vacant. It was not named in the moment, but I thought hovering over this scene is the question of God. I thought, I'm seeing a life, a family's life, fall apart. It was in a counseling office that I saw it. They came in as a couple. This was the first time she would tell him. She said, I no longer love you. I now love someone else. I'm leaving. It's over. He catapulted out of the chair. I thought he was going to be violent, but he crashed out of the office only to return a few minutes later, wild with pain and anger, spouting tears and words. The kids, what about the kids? And I thought, a life unravels. A family falls apart. Could be that you came into worship this morning carrying a heavy load, facing a crisis in your life. It feels like life is falling apart and you're not sure where to turn, what to do. If that's you, I'd like to ask you to listen to a song this morning. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing. But I am going to read to you the lyrics of a song. It's found in the 102nd Psalm. It's a unique psalm, unique in the sense that on many of the psalms there is what's called a superscript. It's above the text of the psalm, just beneath the chapter, and it tells us some things about the psalms. It may say who wrote it, a psalm of David or of Moses, the sons of Korah, or one of the schools of those who wrote the psalms. Or it may give us worship instructions, musical terms, liturgical terms. It might even tell us the occasion that caused this psalm to be written, when David had committed adultery with Bathsheba, or when David was hiding in the cave. This psalm has none of those. It does have what I'll call a title, but it has none of those other indicators, which has led some scholars to say, we think this psalm doesn't have those because it was intended to be general. In other words, missing those, it was intending to say, this isn't just a song for worship. This is a song for a Friday in the counseling office, a Wednesday night in the hospital room, a Sunday night late in the living room. This is for all those occasions and more. So I mentioned it does have, if you will, a title. Here's how it is captured in this version: a prayer of one whose life is falling to pieces and who lets God know just how bad it is. Have you ever needed that? Life is falling to pieces and you say, I want God to know how bad this is. This is your psalm. I want to offer it to you this morning in 4 stanzas. Stanzas of unequal length, but of equal intensity. I've given a one-word title to each stanza. The first stanza I'm calling plea. Plea. I'm pleading with you, God. I want to read the first two verses, and I want you to get a sense of the intensity that the psalmist is bringing to this prayer. When was the last time when was the last time you prayed in this manner? God, listen. Listen to my prayer. Listen to the pain in my cries. Don't turn your back on me just when I need you so desperately. Pay attention. This is a cry for help, and hurry. This can't wait. Whoa. Who would dare to speak to God that way? I think if you and are honest with ourselves, we've all had the desire to speak that way. So if you're at a place this morning where that's the intensity of your heart, then use the psalm to pray. Now, the natural question is, what is causing such intensity? Well, we'll see as we read through the psalm that there appear to be two realities in the life of the psalmist, one specific and one general, one personal and one communal, that are causing him to reach out to God with such an intense plea. It appears, first of all, that he's very ill, terminally ill, and wasting away. And secondly, his city, the city of Jerusalem, the city of hope and future and God, has been destroyed. The Babylonians have marched in and left it shattered, razed to the ground. Those two realities drive the intensity of his plea. First stanza. Second stanza, protest. Okay, God, I want you to know why I feel this way. Here's my protest. Here's what's going on in my life. Those two things. We begin in verse 3 again. I'm wasting away to nothing. I'm burning up with fever. I'm a ghost of my former self, half consumed already by terminal illness. My jaws ache from gritting my teeth. I'm nothing but skin and bones. I'm like a buzzard in the desert, a crow perched on the rubble. Insomniac, I twitter away, mournful as a sparrow in the gutter. All day long, my enemies taunt me, while others just curse. They bring in meals, casseroles of ashes. I draw drink from a barrel of my tears, and all because of your furious anger. You swept me away and threw me out. There's nothing left of me, a withered weed swept clean from the path. Graphic. Yes, poetic, that's true, but poetic in a way that gives us a deep insight into that which is causing him to say, my life is falling to pieces, God, and I want you to know it. You noticed it there. I'm a shadow of my former self. I'm losing to this terminal illness. Christopher Ash, writer in residence, institution in England, writes this about these verses. Verses 1 and 2 cry with urgent call from deep distress. That's the first stanza, plea. Now the second stanza, verses 3 to 11, tell us the distress. He cried out in distress. Now the second stanza is telling us why he was in distress. The dominant motif is transience, tempus fugit, a Latin phrase that means time flies. In his distress, he feels all the dimensions of the misery of a fading life, of mortality, the images of smoke, glowing, that is, fading embers, grass, and evening shadow convey vividly the desperation of not being able to have any lasting being. Smoke blows away, embers go cold, grass withers, the evening shadow merges into night. It is lonely, restless, miserably shameful, taunted, and grievous. His life is falling apart. And one of the reasons is a very personal one. It's the realization I'm mortal. Life is transient. It's passing away, just like the smoke. We know that. I remember the person who said, hey, the Bible says the living know that we shall die, but that doesn't mean we want to talk about it or think about it. But we know it. We know it even as kids. Catherine Miller, a woman from down in Newport Beach, said that her neighbor next door, 5-year-old Jimmy Jurgen, had a goldfish. His goldfish died. He came over and invited her to come to the burial. Would you please come? My goldfish, going to bury it. She honored him. She went over next door for the burial. He had a little piece of cardboard and a marker. He said, I want to write something for his grave. He didn't know how to write yet. She said, I'll be happy to. What would you like me to write on here? He thought a minute. He said, I want you to put his name. All right, what's his name? His name is Mobert. Mobert, okay? Wrote his name. Is there anything else you would like me to write? He thought about it a minute. He said, yes. Would you write, he was fun while he lasted? That's not totally bad theology. We all want to be fun. But while we last, even that child knows that life is transient. The sands in the hourglass of life keep running. And in a very painful way, the psalmist is coming to grips with that. That's the personal reason for his distress, for his anguish. But there is a corporate reason, a communal reason that's much larger. I'm going to dip into the next stanza just for 2 or 3 lines to give us an idea of what he's dealing with corporately. It says this, you'll get up, he's talking to God now, you'll get up from your throne and help Zion. It's time for compassionate help. Oh, how your servants love this city's rubble and weep with compassion over its dust. What are you talking about? You love the rubble? You're weeping with compassion over the dust? I didn't understand that. But I spoke with someone this week who did understand. Her name is Edel Amundsen. Edel was a nurse up at the medical center almost, not quite, almost 4 decades ago. She gave me permission to share her story. I talked with her this week to make sure I remembered it accurately. Edel and her husband at that time, Bill Shelley, both worked in the hospital. She is a nurse, he is a chaplain. Life was ahead of them. All was good. They were in love. God was gracious. It was on a Sabbath afternoon. They were out with another couple. It was a beautiful moment, beautiful enough that late in the day, he squeezed Edel's leg and said, this is how Sabbath was meant to be spent. And then in a moment, just a split second, with her present, an accident, and he was gone. The grief was crushing, threatened to crush the very life out of her. Trying to survive over the next days and weeks, she said, there came a moment in time when I knew I needed to do some things to seek some kind of closure. One of the things she said I needed to do was I needed to go back to the southeast, back to the southeastern part of this country. That's where we had met, where we had dated, where we had fallen in love, gotten engaged, gotten married. That's where Bill was spending his first years in ministry. I had to go back, had to visit some of the places, had to review some of the realities, had to try to find some closure. Beautiful couple said, you can have our home, use our car, do what you need. One of the first places, she said, I had to go was back to the house he lived in when we fell in love. It was out in the country, down a country lane, a bit lonely out there, but he was always at the end of that road. He lived in an A-frame house. She said, I decided I'm going to drive there, and I'm not going to look in that direction. I know the place, know the road, know the landmarks, and when I get near to the house, I'm going to keep my eyes diverted, and then I'm going to stop. I'm going to get out, and I'm going to turn, and I'm going to take it all in at once. She got to the place, stopped and turned off the car. She said, I was shocked by the intensity of the emotions swirling within me. And then she said, I got out of the car and walked around and turned and took it all in, and it had burned to the ground. In fact, she said it was recent enough. There was still smoke rising from a few of the dying embers. And she collapsed in the road. How cruel can you be? Even this is gone. I thought as I listened this week, as I did years ago, could have been a simple thing to be able to revisit the home, walk through, relive ashes and smoke. But they were precious. What does the psalmist say? Oh, how your servants love this city's rubble and weep with compassion over its dust. His life is falling apart not only because of what's happening in his own body, but falling apart because the city has been destroyed. Protest. God, listen. Third stanza. Third stanza is providence. But before we read the third stanza, it's helpful to understand a little bit of the background, a little bit of what to watch for in the third stanza. I want to read to you the words of the late, great James Montgomery Boyce, who writes this, verse 12, that's the verse with which we'll begin the third stanza, is the important turning point of the psalm. So much so that Martin Luther said, everything that has gone before looks to this verse. Boyce, everything that follows builds on it also. In the previous verses, the psalmist has described his frail and wasting condition. He is like smoke that vanishes. But he has a God who is not at all like that. His is the eternal, immutable God, and it is God whom he is trusting. Notice what's happening then. Transience, transcendence. Stanza 3, verse 12, yet you, God, are sovereign still, always and ever sovereign. You'll get up from your throne and help Zion. It's time for compassionate help. Oh, how your servants love this city's rubble and weep with compassion over its dust. The godless nations will sit up and take notice, see your glory, worship your name. When God rebuilds Zion, when he shows up in all his glory, when he attends to the prayer of the wretched, he won't dismiss their prayer. Write this down for the next generation so people not yet born will praise God. God looked down from his high holy place. From heaven he surveyed the earth. He listened to the groans of the doomed. He opened the doors of their death cells. Write it so the story can be told in Zion, so God's praise will be sung in Jerusalem's streets and wherever people gather along with their rulers to worship him. How did that begin? Yet you, God, are sovereign still, transcendent, immutable, steadfast, stable, a rock in the storm. And so he has told us in verse 2, everything is transient. Time flies toward its end. And then he tells us in stanza 3, God is transcendent, immutable, unchangeable, The steady, solid rock. In fact, he says, write this down. Write this story down so that one day people who themselves feel like their lives are falling apart can look back on what we experienced when we knew our lives were falling apart and notice that we found the answer in an immutable, unchangeable, steady, steadfast God. Write it down. So your kids and their kids will know that when a transient life seems to vanish, a transcendent God never changes. I remember how that was illustrated to me. In the days when I was taking clinical pastoral education at the medical center, CPE, training for chaplaincy. One day toward the end of one of the quarters, we took a day off and the whole group went whale watching off the coast of San Diego. I'd never been whale watching. Truth is, I'd spent very little time on the ocean, on the sea, in any size of boat. This wasn't a huge boat nor a small one, somewhat of a ferry, I suppose, something like that. Big enough to have quite a few people on it, but small enough still to feel the bobbing of the waves. We got onto that boat in the harbor, and they waited until everybody was on, and then slowly they turned, and that boat was bobbing up and down, here and there, all over the place. And pretty soon what was inside of me started to bob right along with it. And I'm thinking, we got to get out into somewhere where the water is more calm. And then we hit the waves and up and down, up and down. And pretty soon I was over the rail of that boat, just refunding like there was no tomorrow. It was absolutely humiliating, but I didn't even have the ability to feel humiliated. I was just tossing cookies everywhere. I fed more fish than I saw. Somewhere back there, I heard people saying something about whales. I couldn't have cared any less about whales. It was a miserable day. Awful. We finally made it back to the port that afternoon. If I had not experienced this personally, I'm not sure I would believe it. Because when we got back, and I stepped onto solid ground, I was fine. In fact, I was hungry. I didn't have anything on my stomach. And I said, let's go eat Mexican food. And they looked at me like I had lost my mind. It was like, what? After what you just made us witness, you want to go eat Mexican food? What is wrong with you? But I felt totally fine. Had you been there that day, and had I walked off that boat and talked to you, do you know what you would have seen over my shoulder? You would have seen the ocean. And you would have noticed nothing had changed. The waves were still rolling. The boats were still rocking. Had you watched, you might have seen somebody else clutching to the rail. Nothing had changed except one thing. Now I had a solid ground beneath my feet. Something stable, something steady on which to stand. And it made all the difference. And so we have the psalmist who says, your life's falling apart. Let me tell you about life falling apart. And he lays out two realities about the transience of life and the transience even of human institutions that seem as stable as a centuries-old city. They're both transient, he says. And that will cause pain and sorrow and agony. But he says, keep reading, keep listening. Because in the transience of life, there's an immutable God, a transcendent God on whom you can stand. Fourth verse, plea, protest, providence, and finally, promise. Verse 23, he's going to review some of this material, but he's going somewhere. God sovereignly brought me to my knees. He cut me down in my prime. Oh, don't, I prayed. Please don't let me die. You have more years than you know what to do with. You laid the earth's foundation a long time ago and handcrafted the very heavens. You'll still be around when they're long gone, threadbare and discarded like an old suit of clothes. You'll throw them away like a worn-out coat, but year after year, you're as good as new. Your servants' children will have a good place to live, and their children will be at home with you. So he reminds them of the transitory nature of life and the transcendent nature of God. And then he says, based on that, you'll have children and children's children. You will have a future. You will have a promise, and they will be able to read what you've written so that they will know that they have a God who does not shift or change like the shadows, even when life does. Yesteryear's great preacher G. Campbell Morgan puts it this way: there is nothing more calculated to strengthen the heart in suffering or inspire the spirit with courage in days of danger and difficulty than the sense of the eternity of God. Stable, steadfast, strong, transcendent, even when life is falling apart. So there she was, collapsed on the road. Edel said nothing but ashes and smoke left. But she said, I stayed there long enough to process some of those emotions. And then I noticed something. She said, I noticed that while I thought all was ashes and all was smoke, that was not quite true. Because there was something still standing. It was that chimney. That old rock chimney. It had not burned. It had not collapsed. It stood when everything else fell apart. By the time I left that day, she said, that had become a symbol, a metaphor for me. That there was still something left. I was left. His memories were left. God was left. But she said, that took me years. I wondered. Years. I wasn't angry, really. Just not now. But God was there. The immutable God just wooing me, wooing me, wooing me. Then I remembered that passage, she said, in Isaiah. That passage where God says, I will give you beauty instead of ashes. Beauty in place of ashes. She said to me this week, it took years, but I can tell you, I have beauty. And it's from the hand of a good and a gracious God. I don't know what you're facing today, friends. If there's something in your life that makes it feel like your life is collapsing, falling apart, going up in smoke, there's not much left but ash and dust. I don't know how long it will last. I don't know what specific ways God will move to get you answers, and I would never tell you that it will be quick. I hope so, but I do not hold that out as a guarantee at all. But I do hold out this. Someone else whose life was collapsing, falling to pieces, wrote it down. and said, this is not the end. Your children, your children's children will tell the tale. Because there will come a day when you will have beauty instead of ashes. And when you have that, it will be because of a transcendent, immutable, gracious, and good God who moves in your life with love and compassion. Gracious God, thank you that He wrote it down so that all these millennia later we could read the tale and know that in the midst of a transitory life, there's a transcendent God, a God who loves us and cares for us. In Jesus' name, amen.